The light broke over the salt mesa not as a comfort, but as an accusation. It was a 5 a.m. copper sheen, thin and sharp, that didn't warm the land. It only exposed its bones. The wind, a constant resident of the high desert, moved through the red kettle wash, carrying the familiar, bitter perfume of pulverized creosote bush and the faint, metallic tang of oxidized iron rock. It was a wind that scraped a man raw, inside and out. Calder Pryor felt it pull at the brim of his hat. He rode, hunched, his eyes scanning the shale-littered ground, ignoring the bruised purple horizon. Calder was a man defined by the spaces he kept. He was the sole occupant of Ash Fork Gulch, a solitary rancher whose nearest neighbor was a hard day's ride and not worth the journey. His silence was earned, bought 3 years ago with the fever that took his wife, Mary, and left the homestead hollow. This morning, the silence was broken by his own muttered curses. He was tracking a ghost, a 6-month-old bay colt that had possessed all the sense of a dust devil, spooked by a sidewinder at dusk and bolting straight into the broken lands. The tracks were small, panicked, and heading toward the canyons. A colt alone wouldn't last 2 days. The coyotes would find it, or the thirst would claim it. The desert was always patient, and it always won. His buckskin mount, Grit, a horse as stoic and weathered as Calder himself, picked its way over the treacherous rock. Calder's world had shrunk to these shallow hoof prints, to the snap of a dry twig, to the overwhelming burden of keeping one more living thing safe in a land that specialized in ending them. He was raining Grit around a basalt outcrop when the wind shifted, and it brought something that did not belong. It was not the cry of a hawk. It was not the whine of a coyote. It was a word. Please. The sound was so thin, so desiccated. It seemed to be an echo from the rock itself. Calder froze. His hand moved instantly, instinctually, to the worn wooden stock of the Winchester 1873 holstered by his knee. He was being hunted, or he was being baited. In this territory, they were often the same thing. He held his breath, listening past the rush of his own blood. The wind whistled. Grit stamped a hoof, impatient. Cut me down. The voice was closer this time. It was cracked, abraded, as if it had been forced through a filter of sand and agony. It came from a cluster of skeletal cypress trees further down in the wash, their roots exposed by a decade of flash floods. Calder dismounted, his movements economical, quiet. He pulled the Winchester free. He kept Grit between him and the trees, using the horse's bulk as a shield as he advanced. He was a fool. He knew it. This was how lone men disappeared. This was the trap sprung. He rounded the last boulder and stopped. It was a trap, but not for him. Not entirely. He saw the ground first. It was churned, a mess of hoof prints from at least a dozen shod horses. They had milled around this one spot, a cruel audience. Then, his eyes followed the tracks to the largest of the cypress trees. Hanging from a thick gray branch was a person, a woman. She was not hung by the neck. That would have been a mercy. She was suspended by her wrists, the ropes thrown over the limb and tied off, leaving her dangling a good 2 feet above the ground. She was Apache. Her dress, once a practical buckskin, was torn at the shoulder. Her legs were bare, coated in the fine red dust. Her head was bowed, hidden by a curtain of matted black hair. But it was the angle of her shoulders that made Calder's stomach clench. They were distended, pulled from their sockets by the dead weight of her own body. The muscles strained into rigid cables of agony, visible even through the fabric and dirt. Blood had run from her wrists. Where the ropes had bitten deep, it was not red. It had dried in the arid air to brittle. Black streaks down her arms. She was shivering, but it was not a shiver from the morning chill. It was a deep, systemic shock, a violent tremor that shook her body and rattled the dry leaves above her. Calder's eyes swept the clearing. This was not a quick act of violence. This was torture. This was a message. On the trunk of the cypress, etched deep with a piece of charcoal, was a symbol. A crude circle with a long, jagged tail curving away from it, a black comet. It meant nothing to Calder, but it radiated intent. It was a signature left by men who wanted their work recognized. He stepped closer, the rifle still balanced in his hand, though the clearing was empty save for the wind. "Are you alive?" His voice was rough, a rasp from disuse. The head of hair nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. "Who did this? Does it matter?" she whispered. "Please, cut me down." He had two choices. He could turn around, get back on grit, and ride away. He could forget the cult, forget the woman. He could go back to his empty gulch and live. This was Apache business, or bandit business, or something worse. It was not his. He thought of Mary, finding a broken-winged hawk on the property line 2 years before she fell ill. He had told her to leave it, that it was nature's way. She had looked at him with that clear, unwavering disappointment and said, "It's our way to help." He had splinted the wing. Calder cursed, a low, soft sound. He jammed the Winchester back into its saddle scabbard. He approached the woman, pulling his skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade was sharp enough to shave with. "This is going to hurt," he said, by way of apology. He couldn't reach the ropes on the branch. He would have to cut her bonds at the wrist. He put his shoulder against the tree trunk, grabbed her waist with his left arm to take her weight, and reached up with the knife. She was small, but dense, solid, and she was burning with fever. The heat radiated off her skin like a furnace. "Now!" she breathed. He sliced the right rope. The fibers snapped, and her entire weight dropped onto her left arm with a sickening jerk. A sound was torn from her, a sharp, inhaled gasp that was half scream, half sob. Before she could react, he cut the second rope. Her body fell free. She didn't collapse. She crashed. She fell directly into him, a dead weight of exhaustion and fever. He staggered back, his boots slipping on the loose shale, catching her under the arms as they both went down to one knee. He held her there for a moment, the two of them breathing hard in the dust. He could feel the frantic, shallow beat of her heart against his chest. He pulled his canteen, his movements stiff. "Water," he commanded. "Not too much." He helped her sit up against the cypress trunk, her back to the black comet symbol. He uncapped the canteen and held it to her lips. She drank, a desperate, choking greed, then coughed, spitting muddy water onto the dirt. She took 2 more sips, slower, before turning her head away. She leaned back, her eyes closed, her chest heaving. Only then did she use one ruined hand to push the heavy, matted hair away from her face. Calder had been ready for gratitude. He had been ready for fear. He was not ready for the look she gave him. Her eyes were black, not brown, but a deep, bottomless obsidian black. They were not the eyes of prey. They were not broken, or pleading, or lost. They were sharp. They were calculating. They were the eyes of a hunter who has been momentarily inconvenienced by a trap. Despite the fever, despite the agony he knew she must be in, those eyes were assessing him, cataloging his rifle, his horse, the wear on his boots, and the pity she saw in his face. "What's your name?" Calder asked, the question coming out harsher than he intended. He felt suddenly exposed. She swallowed, the motion visibly painful. Her voice was a dry rasp. "Taya Kiona, Calder Pryor." He offered his name in return. It felt less like an introduction and more like an exchange of positions on a battlefield. He nodded toward the churned earth. Who were they? Men who liked to watch things die slowly. Her eyes flickered back to the black comet. This was a trap. Calder said. It wasn't a question. "They left you as bait." "Yes." "For who?" "For anyone." Taya Kiona said. "For a patrol. For my people. Or for a lone rancher tracking a lost horse." The chill that ran down Calder's spine had nothing to do with the morning air. She had been watching him. She had known he was there, long before he heard her voice. She had waited. "They'll be back," he said, stating the obvious. "They always come back to check their traps." The lost colt was gone. Calder accepted it as a fact. The animal was dead, one way or another. His priorities had just shifted in a way that made his stomach turn to ice. He looked west, toward the jagged line of Buckskin Ridge. His homestead was nestled in Ash Fork Gulch, a small, defensible position against the wind, but not against a dozen armed men. His instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive for 40 years in a land that didn't want him, screamed to ride, to leave her, to get on Grit and vanish. This was not his fight. He owed this woman nothing. He had cut her down. He had given her water. The debt was paid. He looked at Taya. She was already trying to stand, using the tree to push herself up. Her legs buckled, and she slid back down, biting off a cry of pain. But her eyes still held that obsidian fire. She would die here, but she would die fighting the dust. "Damn it," Calder said. He walked to Grit and pulled the emergency stores from his saddlebag, a strip of jerky, a clean rag. He came back and knelt in front of her. "Can you ride? I can stay on," she answered. It was, he noted, a very different answer. He ripped the rag in two. He gently, grimly, wiped the caked blood and dust from her wrists, exposing the raw, flayed skin. She did not flinch, though he saw the muscles in her jaw locked tight. He wrapped the wounds. "It's a half-day ride to my place," he said. "They might be there first." "They won't be," she said. "How do you know?" "They are arrogant. They will circle, wait for the sun to get high. They want their game to be properly cooked." He did not like the certainty in her voice. He stood, walked to her, and slid one arm behind her back, the other under her knees. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, a collection of bird bones and fever, but she carried the weight of a coming war. She gasped as her arms were jostled, but she made no other sound. He placed her on Grit's saddle, sideways, and then mounted behind her, pulling her upright against his chest. Her head slumped back against his shoulder, her body surrendering to the fever and the pain. He held her with his left arm, his right hand holding the reins. He turned Grit toward Ash Fork Gulch. He did not run the horse. A trot would be agony for her. He let Grit walk, a steady, ground-eating pace. The sun was climbing, burning off the copper light and replacing it with a hard, white glare. The premonition was still there, a cold knot in his gut. He was bringing the apocalypse home. After an hour, he looked back. The salt mesa was empty, a vast, red canvas. He felt a moment of relief. Then he saw it, far to the south, maybe 4 or 5 miles. A thin tail of dust rose against the sky. It was not moving toward them. It was moving parallel, pacing them. Calder looked up. The 3 desert ravens that had been circling the cypress tree were still there, high overhead. They followed, black specks against the blinding blue, riding the thermals. They were not cawing. They were just watching, signaling. Calder tightened his arm around the unconscious Apache woman, her hot breath fogging the leather of his vest. He urged Grit forward, just a little faster. The wind from Buckskin Ridge was picking up, and it sounded, for all the world, like it was whispering a warning. The Pryor homestead was not a home. It was a shelter, a box built of rough-hewn pine logs meant to keep the worst of the elements at bay. It smelled of solitude. By the time Calder carried Taya through the narrow doorway, dusk had already filled the gulch, pressing a deep, bruised purple against the single window. He placed her on the cot in the corner, the one he rarely used, reserving it for the memory of his wife. Taya's weight was nothing, but the responsibility of it settled on him like a shroud. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who has only himself to rely on. He lit the kerosene lamp on the table. It cast a weak, yellow circle, making the shadows in the corners deeper, more active. In the small kitchen alcove, the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt coffee from that morning's pot, a smell now overlaid with the sharp, clean sting of carbolic acid. Calder had located his meager medical supplies, a half-empty bottle of the antiseptic, a roll of gauze from 2 years prior, and a tin of axle grease he used for scrapes on the horses, but which he thankfully decided against. He brought a basin of water, heated just enough to take the bite out of it, and a clean rag to the cot. Taya had not moved, but her eyes were open, not wide, but slitted, watching him from beneath heavy lids. The fever gave her stare an unnatural, glassy intensity. "This will sting," he said. It was the only warning he gave. He unwrapped the crude bandages from her wrists. The sight beneath was ugly. The rope, combined with the hours of her own weight, had rubbed the skin raw, leaving deep, weeping welts. Dirt was ground into the wounds. He dipped the rag in the carbolic water and went to work. Taya did not cry out. She did not flinch. Her body remained perfectly still, but a single, glistening bead of sweat broke on her temple and traced a clean line through the dust on her cheek. She was biting the inside of her lip, so hard he could see the white pressure point on her skin. He worked quickly, his hands, calloused and thick from ranch work, surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the abrasions. He finished by tearing strips from a clean, faded linen shirt he pulled from a chest at the foot of his own bed. It was Mary's. The last one he had, the scent of dried lavender and cedar, faint after 3 years, rose from the fabric. He tore it without hesitation, wrapping Taya's wrists with a firm, practiced hand. When he was done, he stood back. Taya's gaze lifted from his hands and drifted past him, settling on the far wall. On the rough wooden mantel, next to a rusted horseshoe, sat a single, silver-framed photograph. It was a formal portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a hopeful smile, her hair pulled back in a severe style that couldn't tame her spirit. Mary. Taya stared at the photograph for a long, silent minute. Calder stood by the table, the basin of bloody water in his hand, feeling like an intruder in his own house. The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the lamp and the first probing gusts of the rising wind outside. It was a silence of the dispossessed. Taya, torn from her people, and Calder, a widower who had exiled himself. They were two people defined by profound, unnameable loss, and they recognized the shape of that emptiness in each other without a single word being spoken. Finally, Taya's eyes moved back to him. The fever had not broken, but her voice was clearer now, the sandpaper rasp replaced by a low, steady thrum. "Black Comet Riders," she said. Calder set the basin down. He didn't know the name, but he understood the tone. It was a verdict. "They're slavers," she continued, her eyes dropping to her newly bandaged hands. "They ride the trade routes, pick off stragglers. They sell Apache women, Paiute women, to the saloons in Mesquite Ferry, to the mining camps. And the trap at the cypress tree?" Calder asked, his own voice sounding hollow in the small room. Taya's lips pulled back in a humorless grimace. "That was new. They are arrogant. They have done this so long. They are bored. They left me to see who would stop, to see what else they could catch." She paused, and her obsidian eyes locked onto his. "They were hoping for someone like you, the right kind of man," Calder said, the words tasting like ash. He was not a hero. He was just a man who had been too tired to ride away from a problem, and now that problem was sitting on his wife's cot. "They will be back tonight," Taya stated. It was not a guess. "They will come to check the trap, and now they will come to take both of us, and your horse, and your rifle." Calder Pryor said nothing. He turned from her and walked to the door. He slid the heavy iron bolt into its hasp. The sound was loud, final, in the quiet cabin. He went to the single window and lowered the thick wooden shutter, securing it with a wooden bar. The last of the purple dusk was snuffed out, plunging the room into the claustrophobic, flickering yellow of the lamp. He moved to the hearth, took 3 logs from the wood box, and placed them on the dying coals. The fire hissed, and new shadows leapt up the walls, dancing over the rafters. The firelight caught the side of Taya's face as she watched him. It illuminated the high, proud line of her cheekbones, but it also revealed a thin, white scar that ran from her left temple into her hairline, an old wound, a story from a different fight. He turned to the kitchen, ladled a measure of water from the bucket into a pot, and added a handful of dried beans and salt. He swung the iron arm over the fire. It was all he had. While the water heated, he brought her the canteen. "Drink," he said. She did, slowly this time, methodically. as if she were rationing her own survival. When the bean soup was hot, a thin, watery broth, he poured it into a tin cup and brought it to her. "I have no spoon," he said. "It is fine." She reached for the cup. Her bandaged hands were trembling. Calder watched, his expression unreadable. It was not a tremor of fear. He had seen fear. This was the deep, bone-shaking shiver of exhaustion, exposure, and cold. Her body was consuming itself to fight the fever. She held the tin cup in both hands, drawing the warmth into her palms before she took a sip. They sat in the small, fortified darkness. The only sounds were Taya's quiet sips and the growing roar of the wind. It had risen from a whisper to a moan, a living thing pressing against the log walls. It screamed through the narrow gap of Ash Fork Gulch, rattling the chimney pipe, and it whistled through the clothesline Calder had strung between the house and the stable. The wire, pulled taut, vibrated in the gale, creating a high, thin, keening sound, like a woman weeping in the dark. Calder was listening to the wind. Taya was listening to something else, her head tilted, her body suddenly tensing. "What?" Calder whispered. She held up one hand for silence. The wind howled, a rising crescendo, and then, for a brief second, it dropped. In that sudden, breathless pause, another sound carried from the wash below the homestead. It was a whistle, not the wind. It was a low, two-note call, like a canyon wren, and from further down the gulch, toward Buckskin Ridge. A second, identical whistle answered it. It was a signal. They were in position. Calder looked at Taya. The fear he had been looking for was not in her eyes, but it was in his own stomach. A cold, hard knot. The lamp flickered, the flame dipping as a draft found its way through a chink in the floor. Taya Kiona set down the empty cup. "They are here," she said. The wind howl returned, louder this time, bringing with it the first sharp sting of sand against the shutters. The sandstorm had arrived, and with it, the black comet riders. The moment the second whistle died, the cabin's oppressive quiet was no longer a comfort. It was a vacuum, waiting to be broken by violence. The wind howled, a chorus of 1,000 mourning voices. But inside, Calder Pryor and Taya Kiona were perfectly, terrifyingly still. Then Calder moved. There was no panic in him, only a grim, mechanical purpose. He went not to the door, but to the woodpile stacked in the corner. He heaved a thick, seasoned oak plank, a leftover from a mended axle, and carried it to the shuttered window. "The lamp," he ordered, not looking at her. Taya, already on her feet, moved with a fluid grace that belied the fever and the agony in her wrists. She turned the lamp wick down, until the room was plunged into near darkness. The only light a dull, angry red from the coals in the hearth. In that dim light, Calder braced the plank against the window shutter, and with a heavy mallet and 3 long iron spikes, he began to hammer. The sound was a violation. Each blow, a rhythmic, percussive thud, thunk, was a defiant answer to the whistles in the dark. It was the sound of a coffin being nailed shut, or a fort being born. It was a declaration, "We are here, we are waiting." While he worked, Taya moved through the shadows. She was no longer a victim. She was a strategist. Her eyes, accustomed to the dark, swept the small space. She ran her bandaged hands over the log walls, checking for chinks, for weaknesses. Calder finished at the window. He kicked the worn bearskin rug from the center of the floor, exposing the uneven floorboards. "Ricochet," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He pointed to the half-inch gaps. "A bullet finds a hole. It can come up through the floor. Take your leg off, or worse." He grabbed a handful of old rags and a spare length of rope and began jamming them into the gaps, his breath hissing between his teeth. Taya, meanwhile, had moved to the mantel, to Calder's meager arsenal. She lifted the Winchester 1873. It was heavy, but she balanced it, her bandaged fingers automatically finding the lever. She worked the action. A clean, satisfying click. It was oiled, maintained. She brought it to her nose, smelling the faint, sharp scent of hops number 9. She nodded, a small, grim approval. She found the box of cartridges. 4440, she counted them. 22 rounds. Not a war, not even a skirmish. Just a long, drawn-out argument. She moved to the drawer where he kept his reloading tools. Beside them lay the Colt Navy, a relic from a different war. She picked it up. It was heavy with rust and neglect. She tried to spin the cylinder. It stuck. "This one is slow," she said, her voice a low vibration in the dark. "The damp has gotten to it. It will fire once, maybe twice, then it will be a hammer." Calder grunted, not looking up from the floor. "It was my father's. It's a memory, not a weapon." Taya placed the useless pistol back in the drawer. Her hand brushed against something. The deer-bone knife. Calder had set it there after tending her wounds. Her fingers closed around the familiar, carved hilt. The knife, its blade milky white and honed to a razor's edge, seemed to come alive in her hand. The Colt was a memory. The Winchester was a tool, but this knife, this was a promise. "1 rifle," she said, her voice clear over the storm. 22 rounds, and a promise. "We need to slow them down," Calder said, rising. The floor was as sealed as he could make it. The door. He meant the heavy oak dining table, the one he and Mary had built together. It was the last good thing in the room. Without a word, Taya moved to the other side. They grunted, lifting and sliding it, barricading the main door. The table's thick legs jammed under the door's crossbrace, creating a solid wall of wood. "The back," Taya said, already turning. The back door, leading to the small lean-to kitchen, was a weaker point, just simple pine planks. "We can't brace it and still see the stable," Calder said. "Glass," Taya whispered, her eyes gleaming in the dark. She pointed to a wooden crate by the hearth, filled with empty brown bottles. Calder understood. He took a thick burlap sack, dropped 3 bottles inside, and twisted the top. He raised it high and brought it down on the stone hearth. The sound was a muffled, satisfying crunch. He did it again. Then he carefully, quietly, unbarred the back door, cracked it open just an inch, and poured a glittering, treacherous carpet of broken glass onto the packed earth just outside the threshold. Anyone coming in that way would announce themselves, and they would do it in agony. "They'll use the stable," Calder said, barring the door again. "The horses will be cover. They'll come from the blind side." Taya's eyes scanned the kitchen, a spool of copper wire used for mending fences, and hanging from a peg, a leather strap threaded with 3 brass cattle bells. "There," she said. Calder looked. "The wind, it will ring them." "No," Taya said, her voice certain. "The wind is a roar. The wind is everywhere. This will be a jingle. It will be a sound that does not belong. It will be close. We will know." He saw the logic. It was a desperate, thin chance. He grabbed the wire and the bells. "Cover the door," he said. He slipped out into the storm. Taya stood in the open doorway, the deer-bone knife in her right hand, her left braced against the frame. The wind tore at her, a physical assault, whipping her hair across her face, stinging her skin with sand. The night was a black, screaming chaos. Calder was invisible a foot from the door. He was gone for 2 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Taya did not move. She did not blink. She was a statue of pure, defiant will, listening to the heartbeat of the storm. He reappeared, a ghost covered in grit. He stumbled back inside, barring the door. He threaded the wire through a small hole in the kitchen wall and pulled it taut, tying it off on an iron hook. He hung the bells. They were silent, waiting. They stood in the center of the main room, the fire casting just enough red light to carve their faces from the darkness. "You stand by the hearth," Taya said. Her voice had changed. It was no longer the rasp of a victim. It was the sharp, clear command of a scout. Calder, wadding a rag around his hand to protect it from the rifle's heat, bristled. "This is my home. I know the angles. And I plan to keep it yours," she retorted, her voice cutting. "They will come through the main door or the window. They will expect one man. They will all be looking at the fire. They will be looking at you. She melted back into the deeper shadow near the kitchen passage. They will not see me. When they are framed in the doorway, they are caught between us, a crossfire. Calder stared at her silhouette. The fever, the broken wrists, the hours on the tree. It was all still there, but it was riding on a bedrock of pure, hard-won skill. "You've done this before," he said. It was not a question. She was silent for a long moment. The storm filled the space. "I was a trail watcher," she said finally, her voice low. "I found the water. I read the signs. I led my people to safety." Her voice hardened, the words turning to stone in her mouth. "Once, I led them to a newfound friend, a trader. He paid me in sugar and cloth. He paid my chief in lies. He gave our position to the cavalry for a promise of trade goods." She paused. "The sugar was sweet. The betrayal was not." Calder nodded. A short, sharp movement. He understood the taste of that particular poison. "My partner," he said, his own voice a low growl. "We built this ranch. My wife, Mary, she took the fever. I rode for the doctor. A 2-day ride. Hard. When I got back, I was too late." He ran a hand over the rough wood of the Winchester stock. "I found out a year later. My partner, he paid the doctor to wait, held him in a poker game for 2 nights. He wanted the land. He wanted Mary." Calder's hand clenched, his knuckles white. "He got neither, but he cost me everything." A new silence settled between them, different from the first. It was not a silence of loss. It was a bond forged in the common fire of betrayal. Outside, the storm reached its zenith. Sand and grit scoured the log walls with the sound of a giant file. A low, distant rumble vibrated the tin cups on the shelf. "Thunder," Calder muttered. "From Cedar Needle Station. That's a good 50 miles east. It's a big one." Taya sniffed the air. Her head tilted. A draft was pulling down the chimney. "Dust," she whispered. "And smoke. Like a forge. They're using the storm to cover their sound." The waiting began. The room was a pressure cooker. The air thick with tension, dust, and the smell of fear. Taya slid down the wall into a sitting position, her energy finally deserting her. The fever was rising again. He could see the tremors in her arms. "Calder." Her voice was so soft, he almost missed it. He looked at her. Her eyes were dark pools in the shadows. The fire banked, replaced by a cold, desperate pragmatism. "If they get in, if they take me," she whispered, her words precise. "Do not follow. Do not try to be the hero. It is the second part of the trap. They want you. They want the rifle. Let them have me. You will die for nothing." Calder looked at her. Then his gaze moved to the mantel, to the silver frame holding Mary's hopeful smile. He walked over, his boots heavy on the floor. He picked up the photograph, held it for a beat, and then gently set it down, turning its face to the wall. He turned back to Taya, his shadow leaping up to the ceiling. "I already left my home once," he said, his voice a low growl that was more animal than human. "I left her alone. I'm not leaving my home again, and I'm not leaving you." He had not finished the word "you" when the sound came. It was not the roar of the wind. It was not the crash of thunder. It was not the hiss of the sand. It was a tiny, clear, metallic jingle. The cattle bells, soft, delicate, and as final as a death sentence. Someone had touched the wire. Calder hefted the Winchester, the stock fitting his shoulder like a missing part of his own body. Taya pushed herself up the wall, the deer bone knife in her hand. The blade pointed toward the ceiling. They looked at each other across the dim, violent room. Nothing else needed to be said. They were here. The jingle of the cattle bell was a sound made of ice and steel. It cut through the roar of the sandstorm, a tiny, perfect, finite signal of invasion. In the cabin, the world snapped into a new, sharp focus. The air, already thick with dust, now tasted of adrenaline. Calder's Winchester was at his shoulder, its metal cool and steady against his cheek. Taya was a shadow against the wall, the deer bone knife held in a low, reversed grip, her body coiled, the kerosene lamp on the table, its fuel running low, chose that exact moment to stutter. The flame dipped, swelled, dipped again, its light breathing in short, panicked gasps. It painted the room in strokes of yellow light and deep, kinetic shadow, making the small space feel vast and treacherous. Outside, a shape detached itself from the howling dark. A man, moving low and fast, his form briefly silhouetted as he passed the rain-empty water trough. He was not the one who hit the wire. He was the second, or the third. The bells were just the overture. A metallic scrape came from the window Calder had reinforced, not the shuttered one, but the main one he had spiked with the oak plank, a crowbar, seeking purchase between the log wall and the wood. A grunt of effort from outside. The plank groaned, the iron spikes holding, but the wood itself was flexing. Taya moved. She did not run. She glided from the kitchen passage, seeming to flow across the floor, and pressed herself flat against the wall beside the straining window. She was on the man's blind side. She raised the knife, her bandaged hand steady, her black eyes fixed on the sliver of darkness where the man was working. The scraping stopped. A new sound, wood splintering. A hand, gloved and thick, forced its way through the gap, fingers searching for the internal bar. Taya did not hesitate. It was not a flurry of motion. It was a single, brutal equation. She brought her right elbow down like a piston, a sharp, focused strike onto the man's exposed wrist. There was a wet, heavy snap of bone. A strangled howl was swallowed by the wind. The hand tried to pull back, but Taya's left hand, the bandaged one, shot out and gripped the man's sleeve, anchoring him to the spot. Her right hand, holding the knife, moved in a clean, economical arc. Not a stab, but a rapid, upward flip, laying the blade deep into the exposed flesh of the man's forearm and pulling back, severing muscle and tendon. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, and fell backward, vanishing from the opening. Taya was already moving, spinning away from the wall, putting herself back into the shadows near the kitchen. One down. The attack was a response to a different, simultaneous assault. As Taya struck, a blast of gunfire erupted at the front of the house. A heavy-caliber slug tore through the main door, splintering the oak table barricade. A second shot hit the other window, the smaller one by the hearth. The shutter it had was thin. The bullet punched through it, and the glass behind it exploded inward. A spray of razor-sharp fragments that glittered like salt in the dim firelight. "Door!" Taya yelled, her voice a sharp command, already seeing the next move. Calder didn't need to be told. He was already firing. He ignored the man Taya had dealt with. He was focused on the front porch, now visible in flashes through the shattered window and the splintered holes in his door. He saw two silhouettes rising from the porch steps, rifles leveling. He levered his Winchester and fired. The sound inside the cabin was deafening, a physical blow to the ears. He fired not through a curtain, but through the smoking hole in the window, aiming at the muzzle flash. He was met with a roar of return fire. Bullets thudded into the logs, into the table, filling the air with the smell of lead and ozone. A round ricocheted off the hearth, whining like a demon. "Down!" Calder roared, dropping to one knee. Levering another round, he saw one of the men on the porch stagger, clutch his chest, and topple forward, crashing onto the wooden planks. The second man, enraged, took a step back and raised his arm. Calder saw the glint of a match, the unmistakable silhouette of a whiskey bottle. "Fire!" Calder yelled, not as an order to shoot, but as a warning. The third man, the one who had thrown the bottle, sent it in a high, wobbling arc. It smashed against the doorframe, and a sheet of liquid flame washed over the front porch. The fire, fed by the kerosene in the bottle and the high wind, was instant and voracious. It was not a crawl. It was an explosion. Orange light flooded the cabin. The dry planks of the porch, dampened only by the memory of rain, ignited. The wounded man Taya had knifed, who had been crawling away, was now silhouetted against the new light, and he screamed as the fire touched him. Calder fired again. His bullet took the fire thrower in the throat. The man dropped without a sound, his body a dark heap against the roaring blaze. 2 men down on the porch, but the fire was the new enemy. It licked at the doorway, smoke and searing heat pouring into the cabin. The smoke was thick, acrid, choking. "The water!" Calder coughed, his eyes streaming. Taya was already there. She was at the rain barrel he kept just inside the kitchen lean-to. It was half full, a precious, heavy supply. She did not try to lift it. She put her shoulder to it, her feet planted, and heaved. The barrel tipped, groaned, and then crashed over. A wave of cold, brackish water flooding the kitchen floor and pouring out the back door, but not before Taya, using a pot, scooped and threw a gallon's worth onto the spreading flames at the main door. It was not enough to put the fire out, but it was enough to beat it back. A dense, billowing cloud of steam and black smoke erupted, momentarily blotting out the orange light. The 2 of them were enveloped, choking, their lungs burning. They coughed, gagging on the fumes, but neither of them looked away from the openings. And in that sudden, terrible silence, a new sound cut through the storm. It was a long, clear whistle, high and piercing, from the wash below. It was not a signal for attack, it was a call, a command. More horses, the heavy rhythmic thunder of at least a dozen mounts, not approaching, but moving, redeploying in the dark. The execution music had not begun, it had merely changed its tune. The fire on the porch sputtered, dying in the wet, smoking wood. Calder squinted through the haze, his rifle up, trying to find a target. The men who had attacked were gone. Then, for a single second, he saw him. On the ridge, perhaps 200 yards away. A lone rider sat on a big horse. The man was a void, a silhouette against the black, driving sand. The firelight, for a moment, caught one detail. The man's hat. It was wide-brimmed, and the light ran along a rim of what looked like polished silver. The figure just sat there, impassive, a general watching a failed probe. He did not move. He did not wave. He just watched, a judge in the storm. Then, as if a curtain had been dropped, a sheet of sand and dust swept between them, and he was gone. The whistle came again, this time a signal for withdrawal. The thudding of hoofs faded, swallowed by the wind. The shadows, the ones with guns and the ones with silver-rimmed hats, retreated. Calder and Taya were left in the wreckage. The cabin was a disaster, choked with smoke, splintered wood, and the reek of blood and burnt whiskey. The sandstorm, as if angered by the interruption, slammed into the side of the house with the force of a physical blow. It scoured the porch, its sound a high-pitched, furious scream. Calder leaned against the splintered table, his chest heaving. Taya slid down the wall, her body trembling, not from cold, but from the brutal combination of fever and the adrenaline crash. Outside, the storm would erase the bodies. It would scour the blood, but it would not erase the hoof prints. They were too deep, ground into the mud by horses waiting for a slaughter. They were a promise, left by the man in the silver-rimmed hat. A promise that they would be back. The storm did not pass, it merely settled. The wind, having failed to tear the cabin from its foundation, fell into a high, sullen keen, endlessly scraping the logs with fingers of sand. Inside, the air was a thick, unbreathable stew of pine smoke, burnt whiskey, and the metallic tang of expended gunpowder. The fire on the porch had been reduced to a few stubborn, sizzling embers, and the orange light of the attack was gone, replaced once more by the dim, bloody glow of the hearth. Calder Pryor stood, the Winchester still heavy in his hands, his knuckles white on the stock. He was listening for the sound of returning horses, for the scrape of a boot, for anything other than the wind and the pounding of his own heart. Nothing. They were alone. He turned, the motion stiff, his back screaming in protest. Taya Kiona was where she had landed, slumped against the wall by the kitchen passage. The adrenaline that had given her a warrior's strength was gone, and the fever and exhaustion had reclaimed her with a vengeance. She was shivering, a deep, racking tremor that shook her entire frame, making her teeth click together softly. She was not cold. She was burning up, her body consuming itself in a desperate, losing fight. Calder set the rifle carefully against the wall. He moved to his cot and stripped the heavy, gray wool blanket from it. It was his only one. He walked over to her. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, her eyes wide and glassy. The obsidian fire banked, leaving only a dark, frightening depth. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement, expecting a blow or an order. Instead, Calder unfolded the blanket and draped it over her shoulders. He pulled it tight, tucking it around her. The wool was coarse, smelling faintly of him, of wood smoke, dust, and sweat. The simple weight of it seemed to anchor her, and the violent shivering subsided for a moment into a finer tremble. He said nothing, just stepped back. His duty done. "They are not the first," Taya whispered, her voice a dry husk. Calder stopped, turning back. "What?" "The Black Comet Riders." She pulled the blanket tighter, her bandaged fingers clutching the rough wool. "They are just the dogs, the ones who do the wet work." Calder leaned against the ruined table, the full weight of the night pressing down on him. "Then who holds the leash?" Taya's eyes closed for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak the words. "It is not about women, not really. It is not about slaves for Mesquite Ferry." She opened her eyes, and the fire was back. Not a blaze, but a single, hard coal. "It is about the land, the new railroad line. The government surveyors are coming in 2 months. They are drawing lines on maps. And my people, we are in the way." She coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "A land syndicate. Rich men who live in clean houses. They want the Apache gone, cleared, so when the surveyors come, the land is empty, unclaimed. The riders are their solution." Calder's face was stone. This was not a renegade band. This was a war, sanctioned by money. "You knew this? You knew this when I found you?" She nodded, a small, painful motion. "Yes. The trap," Calder said, his voice flat, "wasn't for just anyone. It was for, a patrol, someone who would make noise." "Yes." A new, cold anger began to uncoil in Calder's gut. It was colder than the fear, sharper than the adrenaline. "And you," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What part did you play in this?" Taya looked down at her hands, at the linen strips that had been his wife's shirt. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind's cry. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost inaudible. "My younger brother," she said, the words tearing from her. "His name is Neko. He was 14. The riders took him, not to sell, to hold." She looked up, and Calder saw the thing she had been hiding, the raw, unendurable core of her pain. They made me a condition, a deal." "What deal?" Calder demanded. "To save Nako. They said he was safe. If I helped, if I acted my part. They knew a cavalry patrol was scouting the wash. They wanted them to find me. They wanted a provocation. An Apache woman tortured, hung. They wanted the soldiers to ride in, angry, into a second trap." Calder finished, the pieces slamming together. "An ambush. They wanted to wipe out a patrol, blame it on renegades, and bring the full weight of the army down on your people. To clear the land for them, for free." "Yes," she wept, the tears finally coming, hot and silent, cutting clean tracks through the grime on her face. "I was the bait, the price for my brother." Calder turned away from her, a wave of disgust and fury making him sick. He was a fool, a goddamn fool. He had not saved a victim. He had stumbled into a conspiracy. He had been used, a pawn in a game so large and so rotten it stained the sky. He was caught, wedged between his own sense of right and a web of lies that would surely kill him. "But I saw you," she whispered, her voice desperate, pulling him back. Before you heard me, I saw you riding. You were not a soldier. You were alone, tracking. You were just a man. He faced her again, his expression hard. So I broke the plan. Her voice gained a fraction of its strength. They were watching. They were waiting for the soldiers. But I saw you, and I could not let them take you, too. I could not be the bait that killed one more decent man. So I called out. I broke the silence. I ruined their ambush. She took a shuddering breath. When they attacked here, tonight, they were not just checking a trap. They were punishing me for failing. And you for interfering. Calder stared at her. The anger was still there, a hot knot in his belly. But it was now confused, complicated by a truth he could not deny. She had been trapped, same as him. And in the one moment she had a choice. She had chosen to spare him. She had, in fact, saved his life by sacrificing her own, and her brother's. He felt the sharp, terrible pivot of his isolation breaking. He was angry, yes, but not at her. He was angry that he had been dragged into a fight he could not, in good conscience, now walk away from. They will not stop, he said. It was a statement of fact. No. Taya wiped her face with her bandaged wrist, smearing the dirt. They cannot. They need the water. Calder looked at her, confused. The water, the wash is dry. Taya's gaze became sharp. She reached down, her movement stiff with pain, to the high top of her worn moccasin. She grunted, her fingers working at something hidden inside. She pulled free a small, oilcloth pouch, no bigger than his palm, dark with sweat and trail dust. She held it out to him. He took it. It was surprisingly heavy. He unwrapped the cloth, his fingers fumbling. Inside was a piece of tanned, stretched leather, folded into a tight square. He unfolded it. It was a map. Not a white man's map of lines and squares, but a map of signs. It was drawn in charcoal and some kind of red ochre. It showed the ridges, the mesas, and a series of small, intricate symbols, watermarks, the ancient wells. Taya breathed, her eyes on the map. Our grandfathers dug them. They are hidden. They are deep. They tap the water under the rock. They never run dry, not even in the long summer. She pointed a trembling finger. They are the only sure water between here and the rail line. The syndicate knows. Without this water, they cannot build. Their workers cannot live. Their engines cannot run. Calder was tracing the lines, his rough thumb moving over the crude drawing of Buckskin Ridge. This map was not just life. It was wealth. It was power. Then he saw it. In the bottom corner, pressed into the leather, was a seal. It was not Apache. It was a white man's seal, an embossing, a circle, with ornate letters. The Persimmon Bend Chamber of Commerce. Calder read aloud, the name turning to poison on his tongue. Persimmon Bend. The clean town. The town with the whitewashed church and the tidy storefronts. 100 miles from the grit and death of the frontier. And beneath the seal, a signature. It was faint. The ink bled into the leather, but it was unmistakable. A sharp, arrogant loop. Calder's blood ran cold. The fury he had felt earlier was nothing to the ice that now filled his veins. He knew that signature. He had seen it on the bottom of a court order, the one that had stripped him of his water rights to the North Pasture Creek, the one that had bankrupted his ranch and broken his partner's spirit long before the doctor's delay. Judge Alistair Voke, he said, the name a curse. Taya nodded. The gentlemen. They are the true syndicate. Calder Pryor finally understood. It was not just his partner. It was not just a crooked game. It was Voke. It had always been Voke. The judge who had stolen his water was now trying to steal the land from an entire people. And his past, the one he had ridden into the gulch to escape, had just ridden in, guns blazing, and set his house on fire. We have to go, Calder said, his voice a low, hard growl. Go where? Taya asked, her body slumping. We are one rifle, against a judge. To Persimmon Bend. Calder was already moving, checking the loads in the Winchester, his mind a cold, clear engine of war. There is one man there, a deputy. Rowan Pike. A lawman. Taya's voice was full of scorn. He is one of them. No, Calder said. He's not. He's quiet, and he owes me. He looked at Taya. He owes me for a night I kept my mouth shut when his brother was on the wrong end of a branding iron. Pike will listen. He looked at the black sand-blasted square of the window. The storm was still raging. It was not yet dawn. We leave in the morning, he declared. We'll be seen, but it's the only way. We need light to spot them before they spot us. He looked back at Taya. The fever was painting bright. Unhealthy spots on her cheeks. You need to sleep. One of us has to. I cannot, she whispered, her eyes heavy. You will, he said. He pointed to the cot. Take it. I will watch. She was too weak to argue. She stumbled to the cot and collapsed, pulling the wool blanket with her. She was asleep in seconds, her body finally surrendering. Calder sat on the floor, his back to the wall, the Winchester across his knees. Facing the barricaded door, he fed the fire, log by log, keeping the red glow alive. The cabin was a wreck, but it was, for now, a fortress. An hour before dawn, the storm broke, the wind died, leaving a profound, ringing silence. Calder's eyes were gritty, burning from smoke and lack of sleep. He heard a sound, a soft breath. Taya was awake. She was sitting up on the cot, watching him. Your turn, she whispered, her voice still thick. I will watch the door. He was too tired to argue. He nodded, stood, and crossed the small room. He didn't take the cot. He sat where she had been, his back to the wall near the kitchen, so they could watch both entrances. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes for just a minute. Taya sat where he had been, her knees drawn up, the deer bone knife in her hand. They sat in the quiet, smoky dark, two wounded animals sharing a den. The space between them was no more than 5 feet. Calder, his eyes closed, could feel the heat radiating from her. He could hear the soft, shallow rasp of her breath. He breathed in, and the air was shared. It was the scent of smoke, dust, and the faint, human warmth of her. It was an intimacy neither had asked for, a proximity born of desperation, not affection. And yet, it was a comfort. It was the first time in 3 years Calder Pryor had not been completely, utterly, alone. Dawn broke not with a whisper, but with a gasp. The sandstorm had scoured the world, leaving the air thin, cold, and smelling of ozone and wet iron. The sky was a pale, bruised gray. Calder Pryor kicked open the splintered, smoking remains of his front door and stepped out onto the porch. The bodies were gone. The wind and the sand had been a meticulous undertaker, leaving nothing but the dark, ugly stain of burnt whiskey on the planks. Calder looked at the churned mud, the deep impressions left by the riders. The storm had not erased the evidence. It had merely set it in stone. Taya Kiona was behind him, a shadow in the ruined doorway. She held the deerskin map in one hand, the deer bone knife in the other. The fever had receded, beaten back by the adrenaline of the fight, but it left her hollow-eyed and trembling, a ghost in a borrowed wool blanket. Grit is fine, Calder said, his voice a low rasp, but the mare is restless. He had a second horse, a sturdy buckskin mare, kept in the small, solid-built stable. She had survived the noise, if not the terror. Can you ride? Taya just nodded, tucking the map back into her moccasin. They moved with the grim economy of soldiers. Calder loaded the Winchester, chambering around. He checked his own small, boot-worn revolver, a 5-shot Colt New Line, and handed it, and a sparse handful of cartridges to Taya. It was a paltry weapon, but it was better than a knife. She took it without a word, her bandaged fingers surprisingly deft as she checked the load. He saddled Grit and the mare. He did not look at the ruins of his ranch, at the splintered door and the shattered window. He had already left it. They rode out of Ash Fork Gulch, Calder in the lead, Taya close behind, the mare picking her way nervously over the storm-washed rocks. They rode east, toward the rising watery sun and the distant promise of Persimmon Bend. They rode for 2 hours in silence, pushing through a landscape that felt alien and newly hostile. The world was too quiet, the air too clean. By mid-morning, they reached Cholla Pass, a narrow, winding canyon that cut through a spine of red rock. It was the only fast way through. It was also a perfect trap. Calder reined in. "I'll go first. If you hear a shot, you ride back. You hear me? You ride back to the gulch, and you hide." Taya urged her mare up beside him. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the ground. The storm had wiped away all the old tracks, but it had left a new, clean slate. "You're reading the wrong page," she said, her voice soft. "What?" she pointed. "The wind. After the rain. It came from the north. See how the sand is piled on the south side of that cholla? It's fine, like powder, but there." She pointed to a patch of ground that looked identical to Calder. "The sand is blurred, damp. Something passed over it less than an hour ago. 2 horses, walking, heavy." Calder stared. He saw nothing but sand. "They are not ahead of us," she continued, her eyes scanning the ridgeline above. "They are, with us." She looked back, her gaze sweeping the trail they had just ridden. "And behind us." "A tail," Calder said, his hand tightening on the Winchester. "A herding party," she corrected. "They are not following. They are pushing us. They want us in the pass." As if her words had summoned them, 2 riders appeared from a gap in the rocks ahead, blocking the path. They were not comet riders. They were law, or so the cheap, tin stars pinned to their dusters claimed. "Well now, hold up there, folks," the first one called out, his voice a false, oily, friendly. He was a big man, with a face like a slab of raw meat. "Just need to ask you a few questions, seeing as this is a restricted area, on account of the Apache troubles." Calder raised one hand slowly, his other never leaving his rifle. "We're just passing through, Marshal, heading to Persimmon Bend." The second man, smaller, with nervous, rat-like eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "That's Judge Vogt's territory. He likes to know who's coming to visit." Taya had not moved. Her mare stood beside Calder's, but Taya herself seemed to have grown, to have become part of the rock and the wind. Her hand was hidden in the folds of the blanket. "They're liars," she whispered, so low only Calder could hear. "The one on the left, his boot. I saw it at the cypress tree." Calder didn't hesitate. He had spent a lifetime in this land, and he knew the difference between a real lawman and a vulture with a tin badge. "Now!" he yelled. He did not fire. He did not threaten. He dug his heels into Grit's flanks, and the powerful horse lunged forward, not at the men, but at the narrow gap between them. The men, startled, fumbled for their own guns. "Hey, ride!" Taya screamed, her voice a warrior's cry. She brought her own arm up. The small revolver barked, a sharp, angry sound. She did not aim at the men. She fired at the rock wall just above the smaller man's head. The bullet whined, sending a spray of stone chips and stinging dust into the man's face. He cried out, his horse rearing in panic. In that single chaotic second, Calder was through. He charged into the pass, Grit's hooves striking sparks from the stone. Taya was right on his tail, the mare running flat out, her ears pinned. A shot roared behind them, the heavy slugs smashing into the canyon wall where Calder had been a second before. Curses followed, swallowed by the rising wind and the thunder of their own retreat. They did not slow. They raced through the twisting canyon, expecting a bullet in the back at any moment, but no one followed. The herders had failed. The trap was sprung and empty. When they burst out of the far side of Cholla Pass, they were met by a new enemy. The sky, which had been a pale gray, was now a deep, bruised, churning purple. The wind from Cedar Needle Station had arrived, and it brought a cold, driving rain. Not a desert sprinkle, but a high-country deluge, needles of ice and water that struck with force. In minutes, they were soaked to the bone. "We can't make the bend," Calder yelled over the roar of the new storm. "We'll freeze first." Taya's face was sheet white. The heat from her fever, her only source of warmth, was being stolen by the wind. She was shaking so hard she could barely stay in the saddle. Calder looked around, his eyes desperate. This was Vok's country, and it was as merciless as the man himself. Then he saw it, a dark smudge against the cliffside, a place he had used once, years ago. "This way," he shouted, turning Grit off the main trail. It was an old shepherd's hut, a line width. It was less a building and more a curated pile of rocks, a low-slung, U-shaped shelter built against an overhanging ledge. It was dark. It smelled of damp and old sheep, but it was out of the wind and the driving rain. They half fell from their horses, their limbs numb and unresponsive. Calder pushed the animals into the most sheltered part of the overhang, then shoved Taya toward the hut's low opening. "Get in!" he followed, stumbling into the near-total darkness. The rain hammered on the flat stones of the roof. It was colder inside than out, the damp seeping from the very rock. "Fire!" Taya chattered, her voice barely a whisper. "We need fire." "No tinder." Calder grunted, his own teeth knocking together, but he was already fumbling in his saddlebag, which he had torn from the horse. His hands were numb, clumsy claws, but he found his tinderbox. He found a few dry, splintered pieces of wood, left by some other desperate soul. He struck the flint and steel. A spark, another. He cursed as his numb fingers failed. "Here." Taya's hand, small and bandaged, closed over his. She was shaking, but her will was a hot, solid thing. She guided his hand, her body pressing against his in the dark. Together, they got a spark to catch on the charcloth. A tiny, ember-red eye opened in the dark. Calder gently. His breath held, fed it the smallest splinters. A thin curl of smoke, a tiny, weak flame. He fed it a larger piece. The fire caught. It was a small, smoky, pathetic thing. But it was light and it was warmth. It was life. They huddled over it, their shoulders touching, their hands held out to the greedy new flame. The firelight flickered, painting their faces in orange and gold. Calder looked at Taya. She was a drowned thing, her black hair plastered to her skull, her lips a pale, bloodless blue. He unwrapped his saddle roll, pulled out his heavy canvas coat, the one lined with wool. "Here," he said, his voice thick. "Put this on. Your clothes are soaked." She was shivering too hard to object. She reached for the coat. As she did, she had to shrug off the sodden wool blanket. The torn, damp buckskin of her dress clung to her, and as she moved, the firelight caught the skin of her shoulder. Calder's hand, holding the coat, froze in midair. He had seen the scar on her temple. This was different. This was on the curve of her shoulder, an old, silvered, puckered mark. It was not a brand he recognized, not cattle or horse. It was a symbol, a small, perfect, hideous star. It was a scar of ownership, burned into her flesh. He said nothing. He could not. He just stared at the mark, his mind full of a new, sick understanding of what the Black Comet Riders truly were. Taya, seeing his gaze locked on her, did not flinch. She did not cover herself. Her eyes met his in the firelight, and her look was ancient, full of a pain he could not possibly comprehend, but also full of a defiant, unbreakable pride. Calder slowly, deliberately, lifted the coat and placed it over her shoulders. His calloused fingers brushed the scar, a brief, accidental touch that felt like a brand itself. She pulled the coat on, wincing as the movement pulled at her tortured wrists and shoulders. She sat, huddling, pulling her knees to her chest. Calder sat beside her, so close their thighs touched. They shared the tiny circle of heat. The only sound was the drumming rain and the hiss of the fire. Then, Taya moved. She did not look at him. She just slowly, with a deliberation that was almost painful, lifted her right hand, the one that was raw and bandaged, and placed it flat on his chest, over his heart. Calder stopped breathing. He sat, a statue of stone, feeling the small, light, hot pressure of her hand through his wet shirt. "I am counting," she whispered, her voice a rasp. "The beats." She closed her eyes. "To know I am still alive." He looked down at her hand. So small, so broken. yet resting on him with such absolute, trusting weight. His own heart, under her palm, gave a heavy, unsteady lurch, then settled into its slow, strong rhythm. He slowly, so as not to startle her, covered her hand with his. His hand was huge, engulfing hers. He was not removing it. He was holding it in place. A silent, mutual anchor in the storm. He could feel the fine tremor that ran through her. He could smell the wood smoke in her hair, the rain on her skin. The firelight painted her face, her closed eyelids, the sharp, proud line of her nose. She turned her head, her cheek brushing his rough, wet shirt. Her eyes opened. She was looking up at him. They were inches apart, their breath, visible as steam in the cold air, mingled, became one. He leaned in, a fraction of an inch. She did not pull away. She met him, rising just as slightly. Their foreheads touched, a pause, a question asked and answered. His eyes were on hers. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a victim, not as a warrior, but as Taya. Their noses brushed, a soft, innocent touch, and then his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of hunger. It was a kiss of confirmation. It was warmth in a world of ice. It was breath, shared. It was slow and deep, and it was the first gentle thing that had happened to either of them in a long, long time. It tasted of smoke and rain and salt and a desperate shared survival. When the kiss finally, reluctantly, ended, they did not pull apart. Calder's arms went around her, pulling her close, his hands splayed on her back, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. He rubbed her back, his hand a source of strong, steady warmth. Taya gave a small, shuddering sigh, and her body, which had been a coiled spring of tension and pain for as long as he had known her, finally went limp. She relaxed, she surrendered, not to him, but to the exhaustion, to the safety of the moment. Her head found the hollow of his shoulder, and she rested there. Her own hands, which had been limp, came up and weakly, but firmly, grasped the front of his shirt. Holding on, Calder held her, his chin resting on the top of her damp hair. He stared into the small, brave fire, a new, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his own chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. They sat like that for a long time. He felt her breathing deepen, and he knew she was, at last, asleep. He had his own wool blanket in his saddle roll. He reached for it, and with a gentle, practiced motion, he wrapped it around both of them, sealing in their shared heat. They leaned back against the cold, ungiving stone wall, but they were no longer two separate, freezing people. They were a single island of warmth, wrapped in wool and a new, unspoken promise. The rain hammered on the stones, but inside the hut there was, for the first time, peace. The rain stopped just before the gray light of dawn. Calder had not slept, but he felt a strange, weary calm. Taya stirred in his arms, her breath a warm puff against his neck. They saddled the horses in silence. The world was washed clean, the air sharp and cold. They did not speak of the night. They did not look at each other's eyes for too long. But as Calder gave Taya a hand up onto the mare, his hand lingered on hers for a beat longer than necessary. A knot had been tied. A line had been drawn, no longer between them, but connecting them. An invisible, tensile thread. Thrumming with the shared danger and the quiet heat of the stone hut, they rode out, side by side, toward Persimmon Bend. Persimmon Bend was not a town. It was an argument. It was a grid of neat, whitewashed, clapboard buildings set down in the middle of a red, unforgiving wilderness, a statement of defiance against the dust and the heat. It had a church with a real steeple, a bank with a brick facade, and a town square with not a single living tree. It was, Calder thought as they rode in, the cleanest, falsest place he had ever seen. They were ghosts at a banquet. Calder, his face stubbled and grim, his clothes stiff with dried mud and the faint, coppery smell of blood. Taya, wrapped in his canvas coat, her hair tied back with a leather thong, her dark eyes missing nothing. They looked like the wilderness the town was so desperate to forget. and the looks they received were sharp with suspicion and distaste. They split at the edge of town, a silent, agreed-upon plan. Taya slid from the mare, melting into the alleyway between the assessayer's office and the laundry, a shadow in a town that hated shadows. Calder rode on, his back straight, the Winchester resting across his lap, a clear and present statement. He guided Grit and the mare into the public livery stable, his every move watched. He paid the hostler, a kid with suspicious eyes, and then walked not toward the main street, but out the back, into the alley. He moved past the towering, fragrant wall of the hay barn, to the open space behind the smithy where broken wagons waited to be mended. Deputy Rowan Pike was there, as Calder knew he would be. He was not oiling a gun or practicing a quick draw. He was reshoeing his own horse. Pike was a man of medium height, with a quiet, burdened face and the powerful, unassuming shoulders of a blacksmith, which he had been before he'd pinned on a badge. He did not look up when Calder approached. The sound of the hammer on the anvil rang out, sharp and clean. Clang, clang, thud. "You look like hell, Calder," Pike said, not missing a beat with the hammer. "We had a rough night. I heard—" Pike finally set the hammer down. He turned, wiping his hands on a filthy rag. His eyes were a pale, tired blue. "Heard you had a house fire. Heard you ran off with an Apache girl. You're making a lot of noise for a man who likes the quiet. The fire was set by the men who hung the girl," Calder said, his voice flat. "Men who work for Judge Vogt." Pike's face did not change, but his eyes went cold. "You better not say that too loud. Calder, that's the judge's town. They're slavers. Pike, they're clearing the land for the railroad survey. They're killing people." "I know what they are." The words were quiet. "A confession." Pike looked back at his horse. "I've had reports. Missing women. 3 from the Paiute camp, south of the ridge. 2 traveler girls from a broken-down wagon. I went to open a file." He balled the rag in his fist. "The file was already gone. My report, it vanished. Disappeared right off my desk, before the ink was dry." "It's a syndicate," Calder said. "A progress committee. And Vogt's signature is on the orders." Pike shook his head, a look of profound weariness on his face. "Calder, a signature ain't proof. It's just paper. I'm one man, Vogt. Vogt is the law here. Then we need proof that isn't paper." Taya's voice came from the shadow of the hay barn. She stepped out, her movement silent, the coat hanging off her small frame. Pike's hand went to his pistol, a quick, instinctive motion. "She's with me," Calder said. "Her name is Taya Kiona. She's the one who knows." Taya walked up to the deputy. She looked him in the eye, a direct, assessing gaze that Pike found difficult to hold. She reached into her moccasin and pulled out the oilcloth pouch. She unfolded the deerskin map and held it out. Pike stared at it. "What is this, Trax?" "This is what they are killing for," Taya said. "The ancient wells, the water." Pike traced the lines, his expression confused, but his eyes, trained to look for details, found the seal in the corner. He leaned in, his tired blue eyes narrowing. He recognized the embossing. He recognized the faint, arrogant loops of the signature. "God in heaven," he whispered. He reached out a finger and touched the faded ink. "This is it. This is his private ink. He has it shipped from St. Louis. It's a special blend. He says, won't fade." Pike looked up, his face pale under the grime. "I've only ever seen this ink on execution orders." The 3 of them stood in the alley, the truth a heavy, cold thing in the air. "This is the proof," Calder said. "It's proof he signed a map." "Calder," Pike said, his voice a frustrated whisper, "I can't arrest a federal judge for cartography." "No," Calder agreed. "But we can find the men who do his killing, the Black Comet Riders." Pike shook his head. "Never heard of them." "They meet," Taya said, her voice low. "Rich men, they meet to drink." Pike's eyes shot to hers. "How do you know that?" My people have watched," she said. a lie that was close to the truth. Pike looked away, thinking, the Canary Finch Saloon. They meet there every Thursday. Volk, Creed, the banker. They call themselves the Persimmon Bend Progress Committee. He looked back at Calder. It's a private meeting. No one gets in. A dusty sheep seller, looking for a cheap herd. Might. Calder said, he might walk into the wrong room, just looking for a whiskey to wash the trail off. Pike considered it. It was thin. You'd be shot before you heard a word. Taya stepped forward. They will not shoot a servant. She looked at Pike. Do they have girls to serve the drinks? Yeah, Lucy, the owner's daughter, but... She is sick tonight, Taya said. I will be the new girl, the one who does not speak. Pike looked at Calder, a question in his eyes. Calder just nodded. He had seen her with the knife. He had seen her with the map. He trusted her. It was a desperate, foolish plan. 2 hours later, Calder pushed open the bat-wing doors of the Canary Finch. The saloon was bright, loud, full of smoke and the tinny sound of a player piano. He was just another piece of trail trash. In his ruined clothes, he got a whiskey, his back to the bar, and watched the room. In the back, a private, curtained-off alcove. 2 men stood guard. A formality. A commotion. A spilled drink. Lucy, the owner's daughter, was yelling at a new, silent girl, an Apache in a borrowed too large linen shirt. You clumsy, just get the mop. And take that order into the committee. And don't you say a word. You hear me? Taya, her face a mask of subservient emptiness, picked up a tray of whiskey glasses and the mop. She kept her head down. She pushed through the curtain. Calder nursed his drink. The wait was agony. Taya was invisible. The men in the room, Judge Volk, the banker. 2 other men in expensive suits were loud, drunk, and arrogant. They barely noticed her as she set down the glasses. But Taya was not looking at them. She was looking at the man at the head of the table, the man who was just finishing a story, his voice a confident, satisfied baritone. The ledgers at the land office are the last loose end, the man said, raising his glass. I've got the new maps drawn up. We burn the old claims Sunday, after the gathering, while the whole town is praying, and the territory becomes ours. A clean slate. To progress. Taya's blood turned to ice. It was the voice. It was the man. He was cleaner, shaven, and wearing a fine wool suit. But it was him. The silver-rimmed hat was on the table beside his hand. Barlow Creed, the owner of the Creed Freight Transport Company, the man who held the mail contract, the man who was the lead subcontractor for the coming railroad. He was the head of the snake. She backed out, her tray empty. She did not run. She went back to the kitchen, dropped the tray, and walked out the back door. Calder met her and Pike in the alley. It's him, she said, her voice shaking, but not with fear, with rage. The man with the hat. His name is Barlow Creed. Creed. Pike's blood ran cold. Creed isn't some renegade. He's the town's biggest employer. He has a dozen security men on his payroll, all deputized by Volk's office. They're planning to burn the land office ledgers, Taya said. This Sunday, after the gathering. Then we have them, Pike said, a new, hard light in his eyes. We catch them in the act. Arson. Conspiracy. I can't arrest Volk, but I can arrest Creed. He turned. I'm going to my office. I'll get the territorial marshal on the wire. We'll have a quiet welcoming party for them at the land office. He left. Calder and Taya waited. The minutes stretched. Pike came back. Not walking, but running. His face was gray. It's blown, he said, his voice choking. The plan is blown. What? The telegraph operator. He works for Creed. He stalled me, and my clerk, he's gone, vanished. When I came back to the office, 2 of Creed's security men were there. They were asking about a stray Apache girl. The trap had closed. The town was not a refuge. It was the center of the web. We can't fight them, Pike, Calder said, his voice grim. Not like this. So we run. Pike said, his voice defeated. No. Taya's voice cut through the despair. We do not run. We do not use your law. We use the people. Calder and Pike looked at her. The Sunday gathering, she said, her eyes burning. Creed said it. The whole town will be there. At the meeting tree. Calder understood. We can't bring them the law, so we bring them the truth. They'll never believe me. Taya said, an Apache. They might not believe you. Calder said, a new, cold, dangerous idea forming in his mind. But they will believe this. He looked at Pike. I need a wagon, a big one, and 2 empty barrels. What for? Creed and Voke are stealing the land, Calder said, his eyes on the deerskin map Taya held. But they're doing it by stealing the water. We're not going to show them a map. We're going to give them a drink. While Pike went to secure a wagon, Taya sat in the dark, hay-scented livery. She found a scrap of paper, a torn feed bill. She found a piece of charcoal from the smithy's dead forge. Her bandaged hands were clumsy. The writing was crude, the spelling hesitant. She wrote in English, and then she wrote in the few symbols of Apache she knew. It was not a legal document. It was a plea and a promise. No color, no war. It read, just water, just life. The meeting tree was a great, ancient cottonwood, the only living thing in Persimmon Bend's sterile town square. It was older than the town, older than the false-fronted buildings, and it was under its dusty, indifferent leaves that the town gathered every Sunday. It was a ritual of piety and communal judgment. This Sunday, the air was different. It was not just the dry, oppressive heat. It was the men, Barlow Creed's security force. A dozen of them were not in the crowd. They were the crowd. They flanked the square, their gray, matching shirts and polished gun belt, a uniform of private power. Creed himself stood beside Judge Alastair Voke on the small, raised platform, his silver-rimmed hat a crown of secular authority. He smiled, claiming his men were there to ensure a peaceful gathering, a promise that felt more like a threat. Into this tense, controlled theater rumbled Calder Pryor's wagon. It was a heavy freight wagon, pulled by 2 borrowed mules. Calder held the reins, his face a mask of granite. Beside him, Rowan Pike sat stiffly, his cheap tin badge the only, lonely representation of the actual law. In the back of the wagon, Taya Kiona stood. She was not huddled. She was not a prisoner. She was a pillar, her hand resting on the rim of a large oak water barrel. A second, identical barrel stood beside it. A murmur ran through the crowd. They saw Calder, the hermit rancher. They saw Pike, the quiet deputy, suddenly bold. And they saw the Apache woman, her presence an affront to the town's whitewashed sensibilities. Judge Voke, his face a picture of benevolent concern, raised a hand for silence. Deputy Pike Mister, prior to what do we owe this? Interruption of our worship. Pike stood, his voice, unused to projecting, cracking for a moment before it firmed. He held up a single, trembling piece of paper. In accordance with territorial law, he said, his voice ringing out, I have a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Barlow Creed on suspicion of conspiracy, property theft, and murder. A collective gasp went up. The crowd did not know whether to laugh or run. Creed himself just chuckled, a low, confident sound. He did not even look at Pike. He looked at Voke. Voke performed his shock beautifully. He put a hand to his chest. Deputy, on what grounds? This is an outrage, mister. Creed is this town's benefactor. The grounds, Pike said, his voice gaining strength, are in this wagon. Voke's eyes, cold and reptilian, finally settled on the 2 barrels. His thin lips, for a fraction of a second, pulled back in a smirk. He saw the water, the same water Calder had driven all night to fetch from the ancient wells. Voke thought it was a joke. A warrant. For water, Deputy, Voke asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Are we arresting men for being thirsty now? The crowd, eager for a release, tittered nervously. No. Calder's voice boomed. A low growl that cut through the laughter. For stealing it. A flash of light. High, to the left, not the sun. It was the glint of metal on the roof of the livery stable. Overlooking the square, Calder, his eyes never resting, saw it. He had been scanning the rooftop since they arrived. "Taya, down!" he roared. He did not wait. He threw himself sideways, shoving her with the full force of his body. The crack of a high-powered rifle split the air, a sound alien and terrible in the Sunday quiet. Calder's shove was not in time to save the barrel. The bullet, meant for Taya, struck the oak cask. The sound was a dull, heavy thwack. The barrel did not just leak, it exploded. The heavy slug shattered the wood, and a wave of cold, clear water burst outward. A sudden, shocking deluge that soaked the first row of townsfolk. Women screamed. Men shouted, staring at their soaked trousers and boots. At the dark, spreading stain of water in the dust. In that stunned, chaotic silence, Taya Kiona moved. She was not hurt. She was on her feet, leaping down from the wagon into the fresh, spreading mud. She was electric, a figure of pure, righteous fury. Her voice, clear and strong, a voice trained to carry across canyons, cut through the pandemonium. This is what they steal from you." She plunged her hands into the mud, scooping up a double handful of the precious, clean water. She stood, her chest heaving, and raised her hands high. The bright morning sun hit the stream of water as it poured through her bandaged fingers, a shower of liquid silver. "This is what they kill for," she cried out, her eyes locking on the crowd. "This is the water from the ancient wells. My people die for this. Your children go thirsty for this. They tell you there is a drought, and they sell you their own bad water for double the price. This is not Creed's water. This is not Vok's water. This is our water, and they are stealing it." Her words, and the clean, impossible water, hit the crowd with the force of a second shot. The railroad workers, the freight men, the laborers who lived in the dry shanties at the edge of town, the men who paid half their weekly wage to Creed's company store for rationed, brackish water. They looked at each other. They looked at the clean water soaking the dust. They looked at their boss, Barlow Creed. And they looked at the sniper on the roof. The illusion shattered. "Arrest them!" Barlow Creed roared, his face a mask of purple rage, his mask of civility gone. "They're inciting a riot! Shoot them all!" His gray-shirted security men drew their heavy pistols. Pike drew his... "No, Creed, you're the one under arrest for murder, and for the attempted murder of this woman." The man standing next to Pike, his own clerk, the one who had vanished from the telegraph office, suddenly drew his own gun. He was not aiming at the crowd. He was aiming at Pike's back. Pike was faster. He had been a blacksmith, but he was also a deputy. He turned and fired from the hip. The clerk staggered, a look of pure surprise on his face, and crumpled into the dust. That shot was the final signal. A huge, bearded railroad foreman, a man named Sully, roared in a voice that shook the buildings. "The girl's right, I've been paying double for water that's half mule piss." He pulled his own sidearm, and he and his crew, a dozen hard-as-nails men, turned. They did not turn on the crowd. They turned on Creed's gray shirts. The square exploded. It was not a battle. It was a reckoning. It was a chaotic, swirling brawl of fists and guns and a deep, abiding rage. Judge Alistair Vok, seeing his power, his syndicate, and his security evaporate in a matter of seconds, did what he had always done. He ran. He scrambled down from the platform, his face a mask of reptilian fear, and bolted, not for his horse, but for the solid, brick-built courthouse, his sanctuary, his fortress of paper and lies. As he ran, the town's nervous church bell ringer, seeing the gunfire and the running, did the only thing he knew how to do. He grabbed the rope and began to pull, frantically. The church bell began to chime, not a call to worship, but a frantic, clanging fire alarm, adding its own voice to the pandemonium. Calder did not see Vok go. His eyes were not on the judge. They were on the man with the silver-rimmed hat, Barlow Creed. seeing the brawl turn against him, seeing his army of thugs overwhelmed by a mob of angry workers, ran for his horse, a big black gelding hitched at the edge of the square. Calder was already moving. He vaulted from the wagon, landing on Grit's back. He did not need a saddle. He kicked the horse into a gallop, his Winchester in one hand. The chase was on. Creed tore out of the square, his horse's hoofs throwing dirt. Calder was right behind him. They left the town, thundering up the steep, winding, treacherous path known as Switchback Bluff. It was a path, a Z of a trail, carved into the cliffside, barely wide enough for a single wagon. Creed, a fine horseman, was riding with the desperation of a cornered animal. Calder was riding with the cold, patient fury of a man who has already lost everything. The horse's iron-shod hoofs struck the shale, sending up a shower of sparks, their breath tearing out in great, white clouds. Taya, left in the chaos, saw them go. She saw Creed flee, and she saw Calder follow. She looked at the bluff. She knew this land. She knew the Z. She ran to her mare, leaped onto its back, and while Calder followed the path, she made one. She spurred the mare straight up the side of the bluff, a dangerous, near-vertical scramble, cutting across the switchbacks, a desperate gamble to head him off at the top. Creed burst onto the flat, windswept top of the bluff, his horse heaving, foam flying from its mouth. He thought he was clear. He reined in, looking back down, a snarl on his face. And Taya was there. She sat on the mare, 20 yards away, blocking his path. The tiny 5-shot revolver was steady in her bandaged hand. Creed was trapped. He could hear the thunder of Calder's horse on the final switchback below. He did what all cowards do. He abandoned his mount, sliding to the ground, and lunged. Not at Taya, but for Taya. He was faster than she expected. He grabbed her, tearing her from the mare's back. He got his arm around her throat, a brutal chokehold, and pressed the barrel of his own heavy pistol to her temple. "Stop, Pryor!" he screamed, as Calder crested the bluff. "Stop right there, or I swear to God, I'll blow her head clean off." Calder froze. Grit stamped and snorted, 50 yards away. It was his nightmare, come to life. The man he hated, holding the woman he cared for. "You lose, rancher!" Creed spat, his eyes wild. "I'll still kill her, you hear me?" "He won't stop," Taya choked out, her voice a strangled gasp. "Shut up!" Creed roared, tightening his grip. He did not know who he was holding. He was a rich man, a bully. He knew only brutes and victims. He did not know a warrior. Taya did not fight his strength. She used it. She relaxed for one single, fatal second, making him take her full weight. And then she twisted. It was not a move of strength. It was a move of pure, unnatural, practiced skill. A move she had learned to escape iron manacles. A sudden, violent articulation of her wrist and shoulder. A dislocation of the joints that broke his grip, that changed the angle, that threw his balance. He stumbled, surprised. For a split second, his gun hand was exposed, his arm flung wide, silhouetted against the bright, unforgiving sky. Calder had been waiting, not for a kill shot, for a chance. The Winchester roared. The sound echoed across the bluff. Barlow Creed did not fall. He screamed. It was a high, thin, terrible sound. He dropped his pistol, staring in disbelief at his right hand, which was no longer a hand, but a shattered, bloody ruin. He sank to his knees, a broken, sobbing thing. As he did, the first of the townsfolk, led by Rowan Pike, crested the bluff. They stopped, taking in the scene the defeated, weeping tyrant, the battered, proud Apache woman, and the lone, silent rancher, his rifle still smoking. The descent from Switchback Bluff was a different kind of war. It was a slow, quiet, terrible parade of broken power. Barlow Creed, his shattered hand wrapped in a dirty rag, was forced to walk, his good arm tied. His captured security men, disarmed and bound, were herded down by Sully's railroad crew, their faces a mask of disbelief and fear. Calder and Taya rode at the rear, a silent, grim honor guard, with Deputy Pike at the front. Back in the town square, The scene was one of stunned, sober reckoning. The brawl was over. The church bell was silent. Judge Alistair Volk, his fine suit coat torn, his face the color of wet ash, was tied to the hitching post in front of his own courthouse, a spectacle of his own making. This was not a lynch mob. It was something more terrifying. It was a community, finally awake. Pike, Calder, and Taya did not stand on the platform as rulers. They stood as witnesses. Pike placed a table in the center of the square. On it, he laid the deerskin map Taya had carried. Beside it, Sully, who had led a citizen search of Creed's office, slammed down a heavy, leather-bound ledger. "This here," Sully boomed, his voice carrying over the silent crowd, "is Creed's freight ledger, but it ain't just freight, it's a list. Black Comet riders. $50 a head for a nuisance removal." Then, Pike held up a public writ, a simple order for a new well to be dug, the one the town had paid for and that had come up dry. It was signed, in his arrogant, flowing hand, by Judge V. Volk. Pike laid the writ next to the deerskin map. The signature was identical, the same pen, the same St. Louis ink, the same loop and flourish. A public signature for a public lie, and a private signature for a secret war. The crowd needed no more. Volk was not lynched. That would have been too simple. He was cut loose, his badge of office torn from his vest by Pike, and he was locked in his own jail cell. A federal prisoner waiting for a federal marshal. A temporary town committee, led by Sully and the blacksmith, was formed on the spot. Their first act, bellowed by Sully so all could hear, was to declare the ancient wells, all of them on Taya's map, as public trust land, for the use of all red, white, or railroad. Barlow Creed, his reign over, was locked in the cell next to Volk's, his silent, weeping rage a counterpoint to the judge's terrified silence. In the aftermath, as the sun began to dip, Pike, his face smudged with dirt and a new, weary authority, approached Taya. She was sitting on the edge of the wagon, her body finally admitting its wounds. "Miss Kiona," Pike said, the formality new. "The committee, we need you." Taya looked up, her eyes wary. "This is all new?" Pike gestured to the chaotic but hopeful. "Square. We don't know the land. We don't know your people. I would like to offer you a paid position, as a liaison, a native, an intermediary, for the town of Persimmon Bend." Taya looked at him. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the same faces that had looked through her, that had despised her. Then she looked at the small, whitewashed schoolhouse, its doors firmly shut on a Sunday. "I will do it," she said, her voice clear. Not a plea, but a demand. "On one condition." "Anything." Pike said. "That," she said, pointing to the schoolhouse. "That door. It opens. For all children. Apache, Paiute, mine, yours, no exceptions." A murmur went through the small knot of townsfolk who had gathered to listen. The blacksmith looked at Sully. Sully looked at Taya. He rubbed his great, bearded chin, then broke into a slow, rumbling smile. "Well, hell, missy," Sully boomed. "Waters for all? Ain't it reckon schooling ought to be too?" He stuck out a huge, grimy hand. Taya looked at it, then at him, and slowly. She put her bandaged hand in his. A deal was struck. The ride back to Ash Fork Gulch was long. Calder and Taya rode in a comfortable, exhausted silence. The adrenaline of the fight, the tension of the chase, the cold clarity of the reckoning, it was all gone. All that was left were two tired people, on two tired horses, with a long, hard road ahead. When they arrived at the homestead, the ruin of it hit Calder like a physical blow. The splintered door, the shattered window, the scorch marks on the porch. It was not a fortress, it was a wound. For 3 days, they worked. They did not speak of the future. They did not speak of the past. They spoke of the work. "The plank for the door is warped. I need to plane it. The ground here is good. The ash from the fire. It will feed the soil." Calder rebuilt. He pulled the iron spikes from the window, and with a new pane of glass he bought in Persimmon Bend, He reset the frame. He planed the door until it fit true. He mended the stable wire. But this time, he left the cattle bells off. He started rebuilding the section of fence the riders had torn down. His movements methodical, strong. He was no longer a man just hiding. He was a man with a perimeter. Taya did not just watch. She found the small, forgotten garden behind the house, a patch of hard, cracked earth where Mary had once tried to grow herbs. It was a square of failure and memory. Taya took a pick, and she broke the earth. She walked the wash, and she came back with yucca shoots, with a handful of wild corn seeds she had found in a squirrel's forgotten stash. She did not plant in rows. She planted in a circle, around the new, patched water basin. It was not a fence. It was not a wall. It was a new, living, breathing border, a border of life. Not defense. In the afternoons, when the sun was high and the work was hot, they practiced. The tension was gone. The sense of imminent death had passed, leaving a vacuum. They filled it with the familiar report of the Winchester. "You're pulling," Calder said, his voice quiet. He stood behind her, adjusting her stance, his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Don't anticipate the kick. Let it surprise you." She fired. The tin can on the fence post, 100 yards away, did not move. "Now, you," she said. She handed him the deer-bone knife. "You are too slow. You think it is a hammer." She showed him, her movements a fluid, graceful dance, how to let the knife's own weight do the work. "It is not force. It is a conversation." Calder tried. He was clumsy, his muscles too used to the axe and the rifle. He fumbled the hand off. The knife clattered to the dust. He looked at her. She looked at him, and for the first time, a sound was heard in the gulch that was not the wind, or a gunshot, or a curse. They laughed. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was real. The evenings were quiet. The porch was mended. They sat in the old chairs, watching the copper light fade, watching the high desert stars ignite, one by one. Taya began to hum, a low, repetitive, haunting melody. "What is that?" Calder asked, his voice a low rumble in the dusk. "A planting song," she said, "to remind the corn to be strong, that it is not alone. Teach me." She looked at him, surprised, and she did. She sang the words, her voice, as he had suspected, warm and sweet as desert honey. He did not sing. He listened, and the hard, sharp lines around his eyes, the lines of a man who had been watching his back trail for 3 years, they softened. He was not looking for danger. He was just looking at her. One afternoon, a rickety wagon, piled high with a desperate family's belongings, passed on the far trail. They were moving slow. "They look thirsty," Taya said, her voice quiet. Calder said nothing. He stood up, went to his workshop, and found a clean, wide plank of cedar. He took a piece of charcoal, and in his own careful, blocky letters, he wrote. He nailed the sign to the new fence post, so it faced the trail. It did not say prior. It did not say keep out. It said water for the thirsty, porch for the lost. That night, the new, cooler air of the coming autumn settled into the gulch. The lamp in the cabin was lit, its yellow glow a beacon of defiant domesticity. The photograph of Mary was back on the mantel, its silver frame polished. Taya was sitting at the table, wincing as she tried to rewrap the bandages on her wrists. The skin was healing, but it was still raw. Calder, who had been cleaning the rifle, set it down. He walked to the table, took the linen strip from her, and sat. "Let me," he said, his big calloused hands, the same hands that could tame a wild horse or rebuild a door, were impossibly gentle. He worked with a focused, quiet care. She watched his hands, then his face, the way the lamplight carved his strong jaw, his steady, kind eyes. When he was done, he did not let go of her hand. He held it, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. He looked up. She looked at him. He stood, gently pulling her to her feet. He did not pull her into a desperate, frantic embrace. He just held her, his hands on her shoulders. He was not holding on for survival. He was not seeking warmth in a storm. He was simply holding her. "Taya," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time he had said her name with such open, simple, unadorned meaning. He bent his head. She rose to meet him. The kiss was not the desperate, breathless collision in the shepherd's hut. This was a choice. It was slow. It was deep. It was a long, unhurried conversation, a promise given and received. His hands moved from her shoulders to her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her proud, high cheekbones. Her hands, her bandaged, healing hands, came to rest on his chest, on the steady, solid beat of his heart. They held each other for a long time in the quiet, yellow light, their breathing calm, their bodies settled. This was not the desperate spark of two people in the dark. This was a fire, consciously built, log by log, later. They stood on the porch, just for a moment, before turning in. The night was vast, silent and clean, and from the darkness, miles to the east, a new sound came, carried on the thin, high air. A faint, metallic cry, a train whistle. The railroad was coming. The world was changing. Calder looked at Taya. She was not afraid. She was looking east, toward the sound. He took her hand. The town had found its voice. And so, it seemed, had they... The rain came to Ash Fork Gulch not as a violent storm, but as a promise kept. It was a rare, high desert event, a soft, soaking, 3-day mist that settled the dust, filled the air with the scent of wet creosote and iron, and turned the red earth a deep, satisfied mahogany. In the canyons, the sound of running water, a forgotten melody, returned, and in the lands mapped on Taya's deerskin, the ancient wells, the source of so much blood and greed, filled to the brim. The most profound sound, however, was the one that now echoed from the banks of the newly running wash. It was the sound of children playing. After the arrests, Taya had used her new, hard-won authority to gather the scattered, hidden families of her people. They were encamped near the homestead, the first beneficiaries of the sign Calder had posted. And their children, shy at first, now played in the wet sand, their laughter mingling with the few settler children who had come from town, drawn by the open-door policy of the new schoolhouse. They ran barefoot, a new tribe, defined not by blood, but by the water they shared. The homestead itself was healed, the door was solid, the glass in the window was clear. The scorch marks on the porch had been planed away, the wood sanded smooth and oiled. On the 3rd day of the rain, Calder Pryor stood on a small stool, a hammer in his hand. Taya stood below him, holding up a new sign, carved from the same cedar plank he had used for his first invitation. The letters were deep, burned black with a hot iron. The design was clean, a collaboration. He hammered the final wooden peg into place, securing it above the new, sturdy door frame. They both stepped back to look at it, the rain dripping from the brims of their hats. It did not say Pryor. It did not say, "Keep out." It read, "Pryor Kiona Restwater." Half his name, half hers. One roof, one home. A partnership declared to the world. It was not just a name. It was a new map. A few days later, a lone rider approached. It was Rowan Pike. He no longer looked like a burdened man. He looked like a tired, but satisfied, blacksmith. He sat on their porch, accepting a dipper of water from the full rain barrel. "The federal marshal took them," Pike said, staring into the water. "Volk and Creed, in irons. They'll stand trial in the territory capital, not here. It's over." "Is it?" Calder asked, his voice a low rumble. "It's a start," Pike said. He looked at Taya, a deep, quiet respect in his eyes. "The committee is messy, but Sully is a good man. The school is open, and the water is free." He finished the dipper and stood, his gaze wandering around the peaceful, busy gulch. He unpinned the cheap tin badge from his vest and set it on the small table between the chairs. "What's that for?" Calder asked. Pike shrugged, a small, self-conscious smile touching his lips. It's just tin. Calder, the real law. It turns out, it's just neighbors agreeing on what's right. And for the first time, this town is full of neighbors. He looked at the badge, then at them. When the history of this gets written, when the railroad men and the newspapers from the East come, and they ask who brought down the syndicate, just tell them we did it together. He did not take the badge back. He nodded, once, to both of them, mounted his horse, and rode away. A man who had found his purpose and needed no glory to prove it. The homestead settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of healing. One afternoon, as the sun broke through the clouds, casting the wet world in a brilliant, clean light, Calder found Taya inside the quiet cabin. She was standing in front of the mantel, in front of the small, silver-framed photograph of Mary. In her hand, Taya held a small, tight cluster of purple desert verbena, their blossoms opened and refreshed by the rain. Calder stopped, silent in the doorway, suddenly unsure. He watched as Taya did not place the flowers in front of the photo. Instead, she turned and walked to the small cot in the corner, the one where he had first placed her, the one where she had slept in fevered safety while he stood guard. She placed the wild flowers on the pillow. She turned back to the photograph, her expression soft, her hand gently touching the cool glass. "He is a good man," Taya whispered. Her voice meant only for the woman in the frame. "You taught him. You gave him a heart that knew how to be patient, how to wait, even when it was broken. Thank you for keeping him safe, for me." Calder's own heart gave a painful, powerful lurch. He had been a man caught between two lives, and in that moment, he realized they were not in conflict. They were in harmony. He stepped into the room, and his hand found hers. The next day, they rode out, not toward town. They rode to the Red Kettle Wash, back to the place where it had all begun. The cypress tree was a gray skeleton against the clean, blue sky. The earth beneath it was washed smooth, all signs of the struggle, the blood and the churned mud erased by the storm, but the mark was still there. The ugly, black, charcoal wound on the tree's bark, the black comet. Calder dismounted. He looked at the mark, the symbol of the terror that had almost consumed them. He pulled his skinning knife from his belt. The same blade. He did not hack at the mark. He began to scrape, his movement slow, meticulous. He peeled away the outer bark, the layers of dead wood stained with the black sigil. He worked for an hour, the rhythmic scrape, 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 the only sound in the canyon, until the last, faint trace of the comet was gone, leaving a pale, raw, oval wound on the ancient tree. He stepped back, breathing hard, his work done. Taya slid from her mare. She walked to the tree, her hand tracing the new, clean surface. She looked at Calder, a question in her eyes. He nodded and sheathed his knife. Taya unsheathed her own, the deer-bone knife, the one that had been her only defense, her badge of survival. She turned to the tree, to the pale, blank space Calder had created, and she began to carve. Her movements were not the angry scrapes of erasure. They were the deep, certain, fluid cuts of creation. She worked with a practiced, focused grace. When she was finished, she stepped back. The black comet was gone forever. In its place, etched deep into the heartwood of the cypress, was a new symbol. A single, perfect, life-giving drop of water, held and protected by the sharp, strong, defiant leaves of a yucca plant, their sign, their story. A marker not of death, but of resilience. That night, the fire in the homestead's hearth burned bright and warm. The cabin was filled with the smell of roasting corn and Calder's strong, bitter coffee. They sat at the table, the new, solid table Calder had built. The wounds on Taya's wrists now just pale, silvered scars. "It is a strange thing," Taya said, her voice a low, musical hum in the firelight. "The men who hung me, the Black Comet Riders, they thought they were telling a story of their power, of comets and fire and endings." She looked up from her plate, her black eyes, no longer hunted, reflecting the small, steady flame. But they were not. They were telling our story. They were the rope. Calder, who had been listening, paused, his cup halfway to his lips. They were the rope, she repeated, a small, sure smile on her face. That tied two broken pieces of the world together, the part that was lost and the part that was waiting. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. This was not a story of victory, Calder, or revenge. It was a story of rescue. For both of us. Calder looked at her, at the woman who had brought life back to his gulch, who had planted corn in the ashes of his past, who had faced down his own ghosts and given them peace. He looked at her strong, healed hand covering his, and he knew, in a way he had never known anything, that she was right. He thought of that first morning, that sharp, copper light, the feel of his knife cutting the fibers of the rope. He had believed, in his own solitary pride, that he was the rescuer, that he was cutting her down, saving her from the tree, from the trap. But he saw it now, with a clarity that stung his eyes. He had been hanging, too, for 3 long, silent years. He had been suspended by a different kind of rope, an invisible noose woven of grief and profound, crushing solitude, hanging just inches above the ground, slowly choking the life out of him. The moment his knife cut her free, she had fallen into his arms, and her weight, her life, her fire, her pain, it had been the thing that finally snapped his own rope. He had cut her down, and in doing so, Taya had been the one to let him, at last, touch the earth again. And so, the prior Kiona restwater became a new kind of mark on the map, a place where the water was clean, and the porch was always open, and the fire inside was always lit. If this story, if this tale of dust and blood and the unyielding stubbornness of the human heart, if it made your own heart hear the sound of hoofbeats on the distant mesa, or smell the promise of rain on the red earth, well, I invite you to stay here on our porch, settle in, because every night, at this fire, I will be here to tell one more story of the true West, and the next story I have for you, well, it is a shadow, a whisper, a mystery that will take us to the dark, forgotten corners of Painted Hollow, to a place called the Moonlight Well, a place where an old, broken promise is still buried, and the dead are still waiting for the truth. Thank you for listening to our story, and please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, to share your own thoughts, and be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like the video. And give us your support by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more folks.